Kavya, please start the lecture, others will join soon.
Um, Good afternoon, sir, and good afternoon to everyone who's present here. I am Kavya Arora, a second year student and the member of Weekend Lecture Series, and it really gives me immense pleasure to welcome amidst us Mr. P.K. Malhotra, Senior Advocate and former Union Law Secretary. I'll give a brief of Sir. Sir has more than 4 decades of experience in the field of law and has held important assignments in the Government of India. He was the Secretary of Legal Affairs as well as the Legislative Department in the Ministry of Law and Justice. He has been the member of Law Commission of India, presiding officer and member of Securities Appellate Tribunal. He has also been the chairman of the adjudicating authority under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and a judicial member of Income Tax Appellate Tribunal. Sir has also been involved in processing and finalizing legislations as important as the Criminal Law Amendment Act 2013, the Arbitration and Conciliation Amendment Act 2015, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, Information Technology Act, and many other social and economic legislations. After handling the legal issues on matters ranging from constitutional to administrative law and commercial and arbitration law as the law secretary, Mr. Malhotra has been practicing as an advocate. Sir has been an active and regular participant in national seminars, public debates, and panel discussions with legal luminaries and eminent jurists. He is also the recipient of numerous reputed awards, like the National Law Day Award by the International Council of Jurists and by the Indian National Bar Association. He has been awarded for his outstanding contribution to the practice of law in the government sector by ICCA India and Law Society of England and Wales. He has also received the Lifetime Achievement Award by ICCA in 2019. The list is endless. Seeing Sir's achievements and accomplishments, there could be no other person better than him to enlighten us on today's topic of discussion, that is, legislative drafting and art or science. After Sir's talk of 45 minutes, we'll be having question and answer sessions. So, members of the general body, you all may post your questions in the chat box, which I'll read to him for his informative answers when Sir ends his talk. So, handing over to you, sir.
Thank you, Kavya. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I don't know whether I deserve it or not, because even after being in the profession for more than 3 decades, out of which for more than 30 years I worked with the government in different capacities in the field of law, I still feel that I am a student of law, and every day when I interact with the youngsters like you, I feel that every day I'm learning one thing or the other, because according to me, learning is a never ending process. Well, all the participants, very welcome to you and good afternoon to all of you. I must compliment the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences and its team of weekend lecture series being conducted by the students of the university for this wonderful lecture series which you are organizing and inviting people like me to share our vast experience and to learn from the new ideas which you people have and what needs to be done. The topic was suggested by myself for the simple reason because I found that probably legislative drafting is an area on which in most of the universities due attention is not paid, whereas what you do in the universities, you are taught the laws which are passed by the parliament, and that is what the legislative drafting is. And it is generally said that the draftsman is responsible for half the litigation in the country. Why? Because it is said that the laws are not properly drafted. Is it really true? I think in today's discussion, I'm going to discuss this particular aspect. And it is said that the quality of draftsman should be such as to show that this accusation is ill founded and unjust, because it is the parliament which ultimately passes the law taking into account the social, economic, and legal requirements of the society as per the principles enshrined in the constitution. So draftsmen only take care of the legal aspects and put them in a systematic way which carries out the social and economic goal of the society as even enshrined in the Constitution of India. I must compliment you for organizing this lecture series, today's lecture on 25th of November, because tomorrow we are going to celebrate Constitution Day. Why? Because on 26th of November 1949, the Constitution of India was adopted by the Constituent Assembly, which came into force on 26th of January 1950. And till 2015, you may be knowing that this day was being celebrated as the National Law Day. It was not a Constitution Day. It was only in 2015 that government decided that 26th November will be celebrated as a Constitution Day. So I think that recognition itself came from 1950. It came only in 2015. So that has taken so long. So my best wishes to do on this Constitution Day, and I hope that your team will be organizing some good lecture on the Constitution Day also, or some good interaction with the student or faculty member on this Constitution Day. Now, talking about the Constitution, which is the Grundnorm, which is the basic document, and we talk of rule of law, we talk about the Constitution, because all organs of the government, be it the legislature, be it the executive, be it the judiciary, they all derive their authority from the Constitution. And as I generally say, it is impossible to draft a perfect statute, as it is difficult to render a perfect justice. You know, even the Constitution drafting, which was drafted by the best brain in the country, more than 300 members of the Constituent Assembly, they took almost 3 years to draft the Constitution. But still, can we say it is a perfect document? But I personally feel, if I have to talk about the Constitution, it is a much better drafted law as compared to many of the legislations which we are drafting today. And a statute as enacted can be explained by the individual opinion of the legislators, not even by a resolution of the entire legislature, because ultimately it is the interpretation to the laws which is given by the courts which becomes a final, not the legislation as drafted by the legislature. So because the language only conveys the intention, and that intention, whether it is really reflected in the statute or not, we apply different principles of legislation. So as I said, it is impossible to write a perfect statute, as it is difficult to render perfect justice. And I gave example of the Constituent Assembly drafting the Constitution, which has serves of the common cause of the common man, because taking benefit of the different sections of the society and drafting a constitution which will take care of all sections of the society, be it the weaker section of the society, be it socially and economically backward classes, be it the children, be it the working class, or be it the business community, or the economic development or the social growth of the country as a whole. I think if we have to look at from that angle, and this drafting, as I said, it took almost 3 years. But what is happening today? Have you seen that many of the legislation in the past sessions of the parliament of the state legislatures, they are introduced on one day, passed in one house. Third day, it is passed in the second house. Fourth day, the president gives his assent. So does it really the kind of involvement which we want to have from the legislature, is that forthcoming? Now, let me give you some of the example of the legislations which have really created a problem for the society, and probably there is a need for more clarity on this kind of legislations, and probably the legislature as well as the draftsmen are supposed to take care of it. As I said, that when I was the secretary in the legislative department and I used to interact with the people, I used to say that for half of the litigation, I am responsible because I have not drafted the law properly. Or maybe when a good law is passed, normally on the lighter side of it, I'm saying, when a good law is passed, normally we say, oh, see, what a wonderful legislation has been passed by the parliament. But if there are deficiencies in the legislation, normally we see, oh, see, what a poor drafting. The draftsman doesn't know how to draft a law. So probably for all the discredit, it goes to the draftsman. But for all credit, it goes to the legislature. This is all on the lighter side. But that doesn't mean that the process doesn't go on. Because the process for legislative drafting, which has been established, is a very systematic draftsman's procedure which has been laid down. But still, it is not codified. And there is no set practice as to how a law is to be drafted. For the simple reason, because if you're drafting a social legislation, you have to apply different principles. If you are drafting a taxing legislation, you have to apply different principles. If you are drafting a criminal law or a taxation legislation, you have to apply different principles. Not only that, so far as the legal drafting is concerned, I'll divide it into three categories. Number one, your pleadings which you file in a court. That is one kind of drafting. Then you have conveyancing, the legal documents, the agreements, the will, partnership, or for that matter, rent agreements, all these documents which you are drafting, that is the conveyancing, you apply different kind of principles. And in legislative drafting, I think the principles have to be entirely different. These are all three different areas of drafting. In pleadings, probably you can take liberty with the language. Even if you are not fully conversant with the law, you get an opportunity at the time of arguing a matter to place your arguments before the judge in a proper way. And probably you can take more liberty. In convincing, when you draft documents, probably you have to be a little more perfect as compared to pleading, as compared to pleadings in a court of law, when you file a document before the court of law. But you have to be a little more precise because there is a written document which they are going to decide rights and obligation of the parties which are entering into this kind of agreement or this kind of documents. But when you are drafting a law, you are drafting it for the future generations to come and for years to come. So there has to be, I generally say there has to be three basic principles for a good draftsman if he want to really draft a law. One, he should have a good command over the language in which he is writing the law. Secondly, the principles of law, the basic principles of law, more particularly the Constitution, should be very clear to him. And third, the subject on which he is going to legislate, he must understand the social and economic background of that kind of legislation which is proposed by the administrative ministry. Again, as I said, the draftsman is a legal person. He only gives a legal shape to the policy framework of the ministry concerned, which brings out a proposal before him. Therefore, he has to give it a legal shape, but the policy has to come from the government. Take, for example, if you are going to make a law relating to information technology, it is a Ministry of Communication and Information Technology which will come out with the grounds on which, why they want to have a law, what all things they want to cover in a law, what all things they want to regulate in that law. All these things need to be clarified by the concerned ministry, which is the policy making ministry, and then the draftman give it a particular shape. Therefore, it is said that there are certain principles which are required to be followed while drafting a law. But at the same time, drafting itself is an art as to how you draft a particular piece of legislation to achieve the objective. As I said, there can be different legislation. If you are dealing with the criminal law, there has to be a certainty with regard to the kind of offense which you are defining. What are the ingredients which must be met before a particular act can become an offense? And what kind of punishment is to be given for commission of that offense. Similarly, if it is a taxation statute, you have to be very clear as to what kind of income you are going to tax and what are the principle of that taxation. Legal draftsmen give only a legal shape to this. Now, some of the areas where we are facing as a citizen of the country, we face difficulty. Now, because I talked about the Income Tax Act, and because I myself have worked as a judicial member in the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal for quite some time, I'll give you an example of the Income Tax Act. I don't know how many of you have really seen this particular act. Look at the original enactment of 1961. How many sections it had and what kind of language was used in that. What happens from 1961 to date, I'm very sure now we are in 2020 because this act is amended every year through the Finance Act. Like Custom Act or the Excise Act, this act is also amended every year and large number of amendments are incorporated. Even if you ask an income tax officer or an income tax expert as to how many times the act has been amended from 1961 till date, probably he also may not be able to precisely tell you as to how many times the act has been amended. Because, and if you look at the original act and the act which it is today, there is no similarity between the two. And I generally say that the Income Tax Act has become not a taxation statute, but an act dealing with rebates and deductions which are available to the individual. Because the taxing provision as such may be running into 10 or 12 sections, but the rebate and the exemptions or the deductions which are available, they run into hundreds of sections. And then the kind of language which has been used. I draw your attention, if you get an opportunity, just have a look at section 80 HHC. Now mind it, it is section not 80 A, B, C, D, E, F, then you go up to Z, then you start A, B, A, C. Like this you start in section 80 HHC, which deal with investment which is coming from outside and how the exemption is to be granted. Look at its language. Probably even an expert won't be able to make an head and tail out of it. What to talk of a common man who is supposed to pay tax under this? He will go to an expert and will ask him, please explain me what exactly this section means and what requirements I'm supposed to comply with to get benefit under this particular section. If that is the scenario, I'm just giving you one example, not that all laws are drafted that way. But the point which I'm trying to make here is probably there is a need for simplification when you make a law. Of course, you can't make it very simple because then the kind of objective which you want to achieve will not be achieved. But it should be as simple that it can be understood by a common man for whom you are making the law. This I'm talking about the law made in 1961. Now, let me give you another example of the Arbitration Act. Arbitration Act was drafted in 1996, replacing the 1940 Act. Now, after the 1996 Act, which is based on an international obligation taken by us under the UNCITRAL law, we adopted the Model Arbitration and Conciliation Act, which was drafted by the UNCITRAL. We adopted it in 1996. And from 2002 onward, we were trying to make a modification in this particular law because when we adopted, it was taking care of the international arbitration because it was made by UNCITRAL. But so far as the domestic arbitration was concerned, probably there were many lacunas that need to be plugged. So we tried to make amendments since 2002 onward. But you know when the first amendment was made? efforts of the government to bring amendment from 2002 ultimately culminated into amendments only in 2015. The legislature itself took 13 years to make funds amendment in the Act of 1996 of the Arbitration Act. Why it took so long? Probably because there were pulls and pressures from the various sectors. And secondly, the political which was needed, probably the kind of consensus which was required among the legislatures was not forthcoming. So the draftsman has a difficulty when he has to prepare a law. He has to take care of the political will. He has to see that the social and economic problems are also met. And he has also to see that whatever I'm drafting, it will stand judicial scrutiny by the court of law. Therefore, this problem arises. Now, take for example, I give you another very important two examples. If in the recent past we have to see from 2014 onward, two important legislations which were passed by the parliament and which has changed the whole course of the economy, if I have to refer to, they are the GST and the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. In the GST, you amended the constitution and you passed the GST Act also. And you passed the IBC law that so far the economy can grow, and every case where there is a failure of the business doesn't go for insolvency. If there is a possibility of the revival of business for the continuity of the business and to see that the production activity is not hampered or the employment which was generated by the industry is not taken away because of insolvency process, so that the industry can be revived. Therefore, this IBC law was passed. So in the recent past, for the economic growth of the country, two most important legislation which were passed by the parliament were the GST and the IBC. Of course, there are other legislation also, like Commercial Courts Act, Arbitration Act, and amendments in many other enactments, Companies Act also. But I'm referring to just two. Is it anybody's guess who are participating here that how many drafts were prepared for GST? The process for passing this law started way back in 2002. And there were more than 200 drafts which were prepared. And ultimately, the law got a final shape or approval of the parliament in 2014 when there was a will of the government to implement this particular legislation. That will, political will, was lacking because there was no consensus among the states. We are a federal structure. There was no consensus among the states, because if you are making a changing in the constitution which affects the powers of the states also, then the bill must get consent not only of the 2/3 of the majority of the members who are present and voting. In addition, half of the state legislature also must give it a consent. Only then it can become a law. Therefore, that political consensus which was required was not forthcoming. And there were 200 drafts, as I'm saying a rough number, not exactly, and I'm saying on the basis of my personal information because I was part of the law ministry. So whenever there is a change to be brought in the original draft, you come out with a fresh draft. There is another suggestion, say a particular state government, say state government of West Bengal has made a suggestion. You then bring certain changes, you prepare a fresh draft. Then the state of Karnataka make a suggestion, you accept it, another amendment is brought. Then Delhi government makes a suggestion, you make another amendment, another draft is brought. So there were 200 drafts which were. So how difficult this exercise is when you make a law. Similarly, when I'm talking of IBC, now again, IBC is a latest legislation. But again, I personally feel, in spite of the fact that it doesn't still cover all aspects, and one part of it is yet to be implemented with regard to individual insolvency, that is Chapter 3, is yet to be implemented, although the act is enforced for the last 4 years. There are certain areas like transborder insolvency, which is still not covered under this act, but still it has become a very bulky legislation. Now I was looking at the definition clauses which is given in the act. Now the act has got 3 different sections in 3 different chapters giving definition. Section 3, which is a general definition clause, gives 36 different definition plus one more clause, that's 37 clauses in all. And this one clause deals with that any other word which is not defined here, but defined in the Companies Act or defined in the Arbitration Act or defined in the SARFAESI Act will have the same meaning. Then you have another section 5, which is in part 2, which give 28 definitions. Section 79, which deal with part 3, which deal with individual insolvency, gives another 22 definitions. But what is happening that we are defining so many terms, and why a necessity arises to give a definition in the act? Because you want to assign a particular word a different meaning than a meaning which is normally or commonly understood by a common man, or which is the normal dictionary meaning. If you're not giving it a dictionary meaning, if you're not giving it a common meaning, then you define it. So what I'm saying, many a time the draftsman, because of various reasons, makes the provision of law so complicated that it becomes very difficult for a common man to understand that law. And therefore, there is a need to put the laws in a simple term which can be understood by a common man. So therefore, there is a necessity that the laws should be simple, but it must convey the meaning and it must carry out the objectives which are enshrined. Now, it's not that all laws prepared so far or the drafted so far is complicated, but these complications arise because the lawmaker has to take care of so many aspects, different aspects of the society. It has to take care of the concern of the common man. It has to take care of the concern of the businessman. It has to take care of the concern of the weaker section of the society. It has to take care of the concern of the urban population. It has to take care of concern of the rural population. Therefore, this kind of complication arises. But there have been laws which are very simple in their implementation passed by the parliament, and their implementation has not brought many difficulties. Why? Because they were drafted in a simple word, and they were more or less enabling legislation whereby the parliament, without delegating the essential legislative feature, gave power to the executive to regulate the law by framing rules and regulations. The two examples which I can give are the Excise Act, which has got very limited number of sections, which was passed way back in 1941. And another is the Essential Commodities Act of 1955. Because there are not many sections, they are enabling legislation. They enable the central government as the central government to control the commodity with regard to their pricing, storage, transportation by way of making rules. So the idea which I'm trying to convey here is, when you are making a principal legislation, use the simple language, don't make it very complicated. And by using simple language, it doesn't mean that you don't pass the legislation by giving the essential feature of it. Like take, for example, I was talking about the criminal law. If a criminal law is to be drafted, you have to define the offense. For the defining the offense, you have to give the ingredients as to what ingredients must be met before an act becomes an offense, and what punishment is to be imposed, who can try it, by which court it will be tried, and then you go to the general procedure under the CRPC, the trial procedure which is laid down therein. So again, the point which I'm making is that drafting as such, normally what happens, because most of the universities are not teaching these basic principles of drafting at the college level, therefore the draftman learn it when he comes on the desk. And that, therefore, he learns most of these techniques when he actually starts drafting. And what he does, he normally looks at the precedents which are available to him. And once he looks at the precedent, probably his thought process gets restricted to those precedents, and from policy angle, whatever he needs, input he needs, that is not forthcoming to him. Now, after discussing these basic principles, let us go that once to the basic principle of the Constitution, because ultimately you have to look, if the Parliament is drafting a law, as a draftman, what you are supposed to look into once you go to a legislature. Now, we are a federal structure, as I said. So there is a division of power, as must have been taught to you in your college, between the central government and the state government, and the power of the central government to make law as well as the state government to make a law is defined in the constitution itself. So as a draftsman, your duty, the first duty, because the legislations are drafted in the states by the drafting wing of the ministry or the department of law in the state, and similarly in the center it is the ministry of law, which has got two wings, the department of legal affairs as well as the legislative department, which looks into these laws and see whether the proposal which has come from the administrative ministry, whether it is in accordance with the provision of the constitution or not. And for that, what a legal affair man has to see when a draft legislation comes to him. The two important things which we has to see is whether the legislature, if it is a central legislation, whether the parliament has power to make this particular law, and for that he has to look at the provision of the constitution. And the provision of the constitution, article 245 onward, which did with the drafting, 245 onward specifically provide there are three lists in the constitution given in 7th schedule, list 1, list 2, list 3. List 1 define all those subjects on which the parliament can make a law. List 2 define all those legislations, all those subjects on which state government can make a law. And list 3 cover all those subjects on which both the central government as well as the state government can make law. Now, first he has to see whether the parliament has got power to make law on this particular subject or not. Then he has to look at list 1. If it is covered under list 1, no doubt parliament can make law. If it is not covered thereunder, then whether it goes in list 2, if he sees that the subject matter is listed in list 2, then probably he has to advise to the concerned ministry, you don't have power to make a law on this subject because it is the state legislature which has been empowered by the constitution to make a law on this particular subject. But if it is a list 3 subject where both the state government and central government has power to make law, probably he has to see whether there are any state legislation available on this subject, and that has to be taken into consideration. But then ultimately the parliament has got power to make law on this particular subject. Then in addition to this, there are certain contingencies on which even the parliament can also make law on a state subject listed in list 2 of the 7th schedule. But those circumstances are what? What are those circumstances? I'll just enlist 2 for the benefit of the participants here. Number 1, if the government has to give effect to an international obligation which it has undertaken under an international treaty passed by the United Nations or in a regional treaty or agreement which has been passed, then under Article 253 of the Constitution, the Parliament gets power to make law even in respect of a state subject because you are going to give effect to an international treaty obligation. Now, for that matter, I can give you one example. All of you must have heard about the Vishakha's judgment given by the Supreme Court in 1997, where a law was required to be passed for against sexual harassment for women at workplace. Now, there was no law, but India has undertaken an obligation under an international treaty because India was a signatory to that international treaty that we will be making a law to that effect. But the parliament didn't make any law to that effect. Therefore, in 1997, the Supreme Court, in exercise of its extraordinary power under Article 142 of the Constitution, gave certain direction with regard to protection of women's right against sexual harassment at workplace, and said that until Parliament makes a law to this effect, these guidelines will prevail. And it is only in 2012 that the Parliament made a law to this effect. But why Parliament made a law? Because there was an international treaty under which we have taken an obligation. Otherwise, it is a social security measure on which the states could also have passed a law to that effect. The second point on which, even in respect of a state subject, Parliament can make a law is where 2 or more state legislature agree that this is an important subject on which the Parliament should make a law. Then the Parliament can make a law on that subject, but then that law will be applicable only on those states which have agreed and given power to the parliament to make law. And other states, if they want to adopt that law, they have to get a law passed in their state legislature, adopting the central legislation. So I think this is the broad parameter which we need to follow. But one thing I want to make it clear for the benefit of the students who are participating in this webinar, that the legislative power of the legislature is not confined only to this 3-state list. In case there are residuary power, the residuary power are available with the parliament. The 3 lists are only illustrative in nature, but the power to make legislation flows from the main provision of the Constitution. Since the power flows from the main provision of the Constitution, therefore, residuary power is available with the parliament, and any subject which is incidental to any of these lists which are enumerated either in the state, subjects which are enumerated either in list 1 or list 2 or list 3, the competent legislature, that is the state legislature or the central legislation, can make a law on that subject. Because as you know, so far as the interpretation of the Constitution is concerned, ultimately it is the judiciary which has to give its verdict on the validity of a particular legislation, whether it is in accordance with the provision of the Constitution or not. Therefore, the job of the draftman is to ensure that whatever law he is drafting, it is not only in accordance with the provision of the Constitution, but keeping in view the social and economic objective of the Constitution, it will achieve that, and it will stand the judicial scrutiny from the judiciary, that is the Supreme Court or the High Court, which in exercise of its writ jurisdiction can strike down a law which is passed either by the state legislature or by the parliament. One example which I can give to you is, all of you are aware about the appointment of judges. The Constitution provides that presidents to make appointment in the High Court and the Supreme Court in consultation with the Chief Justice of India. But this word consultation in the Constitution, in Article 124 of the Constitution, has been read as concurrence by the Supreme Court by a judgment in 1992. So what has happened? It is in fact the judiciary, a collegium in the judiciary, which makes a recommendation for appointment of judges. But because of the coalition government, probably Parliament was not in a position to pass a law empowering itself to bring out the original provision of the Constitution, Article 124 of the Constitution, whereby the executive's involvement becomes much larger. Therefore, in 2014, it brought a law, it passed a law in the Parliament, which was passed unanimously, that there should be a committee for appointment of judges. And you see, this law was passed unanimously. So it can be said that it expressed not only the will of the Parliament, but it's also expressed the will of the people also. But when the matter went to the Supreme Court said, no, it takes away the independence of the judiciary, and the basic structure doctrine which has been laid down in Keshwanand Bharti case, probably that is also destroyed. And because it takes away the independence of the judiciary, because executive's interference is there, therefore, such law is against the provision of the Constitution, and a law which was passed by both houses of the Parliament and 50% of the state legislature supported it, was struck down by the judiciary on the ground that it destroys the basic structure of the Constitution. So it becomes a very, very important on the part of the draftsman to ensure that whatever law he is drafting, it is following the principle of the Constitution, more particularly the principles enshrined in the fundamental rights chapter, because they are the basic fundamental rights for all of us, and they have to be upheld. And the courts, at whatever cost it may be, they uphold the fundamental rights and also the basic principles of the Constitution as enshrined in the basic structure doctrine laid down by the Supreme Court in Keshwanand Bharti's case. Now, again, as I said, a draftsman's responsibility is to ensure that it not only fulfills the principles laid down in the Constitution. I'm not going into the details of it, but what he has to see that there has been a wide spectrum of consultation before actually it comes for legislation. So there is a pre-legislative consultation process also laid down. And I think it is incumbent on each ministry or department of the government of India or the state to ensure that once it is going for a legislation, it must have a wide spectrum of consultation with the people, whether such a legislation is needed. If that wide spectrum of consultation is there, probably they will be getting a lot of good input, and probably that legislation which will be drafted will be meeting the aspiration of the common man. If this consultation is not done, probably you will find many pitfalls in that. And this has happened in many cases, although take for example the IBC, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of India was drafted by a committee which has taken into consideration the international practices, has consulted some stakeholder, but in spite of that, there were many lacunas which were left in this particular legislation. And therefore, this act which was passed in 2016 has to be amended 5 times in a period of 4 years. Now, once we are talking of a principal legislation, if you are only laid down the broad parameters, for a common man, it is expected that there should be a stability and continuity of law. If that stability or continuity of law is not there, probably a common man is perplexed. He feels what to do. Every 6 months, if you are amending a law, if you are changing a law, that continuity or stability of law for which he is looking for is lacking. Probably it makes the life of the practitioners, I think, financially viable, more good. But so far as the common man for whom the law is made, I think it makes his life more difficult and miserable. So therefore, in addition to simplicity of the law, we have to ensure that the laws which are made, they take care of the objective and they take care of the concerns which are affecting the common man. So I think we have a time constraint. Of course, I wanted to discuss many other things, but so far as the legislation is concerned, I won't say that there is no thought process goes into it before a law is made. A lot of thought process goes into it. There are principles which are followed by this legislation, but it is not necessary that in all this legislation and for all purposes that there should be a wide spectrum of consultation. Take, for example, if an ordinance is to be issued in excess of the power given under 123 of the Constitution. Probably ordinance cannot be issued after due consultation with the public because there is an urgency, there is a need. Similarly, take, for example, the budget proposal where taxes are to be levied. You can't disclose it beforehand. So the wide consultation cannot be there. But yes, even in that, what proposal should be there, how it should crystallize, how it should materialize, on that the wide consultation is there. Therefore, this pre-legislative consultation, it is mandatory. It must be followed in almost all legislations which are brought before the parliament, so that the draftman gets a view as to what the feel of the public is and what actually the public is asking for in this particular legislation, in addition to the policy of the government and economic and social objective which need to be achieved under the Constitution. Unfortunately, as I said, in most of the universities, because the drafting principles are not taught, because for a draftsman, as I said earlier also, it is not only the language on the command on the language, it is a basic principle of Constitution, and he must also be familiar with the various principles of interpretation of statutes, because principles are applied differently to different kind of legislation. Take, for example, if it is a taxation statute or a criminal law, then the strict principle of legislation, interpretation of statutes is applied. But suppose it is a social legislation, I think a liberal principle, a sociological principle of interpretation of statutes is applied. Similarly, if it is interpretation of the constitutional provision, You look at the preamble of the Constitution, whether it is achieving the objective as laid down in the preamble of the Constitution or the objective, and whether it sums up the common cause or not. So a draftsman must be familiar with all these principles. If we have to apply these principles, then it is a science. But when it actually comes to drafting of the law, because different principles need to be applied, therefore it becomes an art. So although you have the basic principle, so which basically are, what is the difference between art and science? In art, there is an imagination of your own mind. But in science, there are set principles which you have to follow. So when the process starts, you have certain principles to be followed. But when actual shape is to be given, then it is the art of drafting which become more important, because in social legislation, you have to apply those principles which can carry out social objective. But in taxation or criminal legislation, you have to apply different kind of principles. So therefore, it starts with a science, but ultimately it is the art of drafting which is more important. Therefore, I can conclude by saying that drafting is legislation, though it starts with science, but ultimately it is an art, and that art has to take care of not only the principles laid down under the Constitution, but the social and economic scenario of the country. And for this, I'll give you one example, that Section 377 of IPC, a part of it was struck down by the Supreme Court. Why it was struck down? It is in the statute books in 1860, because because the norms of the society from 1860 till date have changed. Therefore, there was a need to struck it down. Entry of women into Sabrimala temple. Since there was a change in the thought process of the society, therefore the principles have changed, and Supreme Court give it a different interpretation and allow entry of women, which was not there under the social principles. So I think you have to start with science, but ultimately it results in art. And all of us who are students of law, those who are interested in drafting, and I tell you because you are all students and you must be looking as to which area you should choose in future where you can practice. Of course, most of you may be interested in commercial laws. Some of you may be interested in arbitration. Some of you may be interested, okay, I want to become a judge. Okay, fine, very good. That's another option. Some of you may be going for cyber laws. But I tell you, those of you who really have little more patience, because drafting need a lot of patience. As I told you, in case of drafting of this particular GST law, how many drafts were there? Even for IBC, or for that matter, Arbitration and Conciliation Act, when this was amended, there might have been 20, 25, 30 drafts which were prepared. So you need a lot of patience in drafting. You must have good command on the language. You must understand the basic principles. Therefore, if you really want to choose legislative drafting, sky is the limit. And so far as the payment is concerned, probably this particular area, because there are not many experts available, it's a more paying as compared to even the commercial law practice. So with these words, I think I would like to conclude my today's discussion. Once again, I welcome you all on this Constitution Day. Congratulations to you on the Constitution Day. The whole world is passing through a difficult time because of COVID-19 pandemic. My request to all of you is follow the rules, the regulations, or the instructions, or the protocols which have been laid down. Use mask when you are going out. Maintain social distancing. Wash your hand regularly. And not only for yourself, whosoever come in your touch, please tell him also to do this, because it is not only the Disaster Management Act which can control. Act is only an enabling legislation, or the order passed by the government are only orders, but they are to be implemented by people like us. So our responsibility, even as per the Constitution, it is like the fundamental duties. We always talk about fundamental rights. We must also talk about fundamental duties, which is enshrined in the Constitution and otherwise also. And it is our fundamental duty to ensure that even if there is no law, But if this kind of pandemic situation is to be dealt with, we must follow the protocols which have been laid down so that we can live a safe, good, and healthy life. Thanks for your attention. I don't know whether I was able to cover all the points which I wanted to cover because of the shortage of time, because legislative drafting is a subject on which you can go on talking. If we have to talk about the constitutional principles, maybe dealing with the constitutional principles itself, Article 245 onward, or for that matter, what is finance bill, what is money bill, how the bill is introduced in the House, how it is passed. If you have to go into all those procedural aspects, probably that need another kind of deliberation, another kind of lecture, which we will be interacting maybe some other day if the time permits. For the time being, thank you very much for your attention, and the floor is open now for the questions which the participants may be having. Thanks for your attention.
So that was really an enlightening talk. So we have a few questions in the chat box. I would read out those questions to you. So the first question is from Saurav Paul. He asks, Sir, how far do you agree with the textualist theory of interpretation of statutes? To what extent should we take into account the legislative intent in Indian perspective?
You see, this subject itself, which the question is really very, very important. And here comes the question of interpretation of statutes, the principles of interpretation of statutes which are followed. You can't have a set principle, but the principle of interpretation of statute itself explains us. The first and the foremost principle of interpretation of statute is to give literal interpretation, because it is said that the legislature knows what it in fact want to enact, what it want to say. So therefore, literal interpretation is to be given to the statutes. But it is only when the literal interpretation leads to absurdity, ambiguity, or you find that the objective cannot be achieved by giving the literal interpretation, only then the other principles of interpretation of statutes come into play. And those principles, which principle is to be applied, will again depend on the objective which you want to achieve in a particular legislation. Take, for example, I was talking about the Disaster Management Act. Disaster Management Act specifically does not provide or empower the Disaster Management Authority to impose any kind of penalty on any person for violation of the instructions issued by it. They can say that the Disaster Management Authority can take such action as is required to deal with the disaster, shifting the people to a particular area, providing them medical assistance, providing them shelter, providing them food. They can do all this. But if somebody is not compliant with that, then you have to go and file a prosecution complaint before the magistrate, but it cannot impose a penalty. But take, for example, it has been said that you are not wearing a mask, penalty of say 500 rupees or 2000 rupees will be imposed. Somebody can question it. But given the today's condition, even if the law is silent on that, if you go to the court of law, what the court will say? Yes, because you have to protect the human life. You have to protect not the life of your own, but you have to protect the life of other also. Therefore, imposition of penalty probably is justified. Although looking at the literal interpretation, it may not be possible. I'm just giving you one example. But you come to the other side of it. Suppose it is a taxation statute and tax is to be imposed. Then you have to give a strict interpretation. Unless, the taxation statute specifically provides for a penalty, you cannot impose a penalty. So I think we have to differentiate what kind of legislation you are doing. Therefore, these principles of interpretation become important depending on what kind of legislation you are dealing with. But the basic principle is the legislature knows its job well. Since the legislature knows its job well, therefore you have to give literal interpretation to the statute to carry out the objective of the legislation.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Ramya Chandrasekhar. So he greets you good afternoon. And his question is, the judiciary identifies or points out the lacunae in the legislations. Say, for example, the Shilpa Mittal case, where a confusion in the interpretation of serious offences in the Juvenile Justice Act 2015 was identified. The court recommended the legislature to clarify the definition, but we see no clarification on this even after 10 months of the judgment was given. So, whose primary responsibility is it to remove the ambiguities and take active and corrective measures? The legislature or the draftsman?
Well, good afternoon. I think that's another very important question, whether the judiciary, you see, the power of the legislature, executive, and the judiciary under our constitution is defined. To make law, to legislate law is the prerogative of the parliament. Parliament is sovereign so far as the law making is concerned. But when it comes to interpretation, then it is the judiciary, the way judiciary interpret the law, that acquires a finality. So we say normally judiciary also make legislation by interpreting a law. It cannot make a law otherwise. But yes, if there is a lacuna in the law, if there is a vacuum in the law, then obviously the constitution itself, as I said, I gave you example of that Vishaka's judgment, because parliament has not made the law. But the Indian government has undertaken an obligation under an international treaty that it will be legislating or it will be making a law to that effect, because the law was not made. And there was a vacuum, there was a gap. Therefore, Supreme Court said that till the parliament makes a law, it didn't say that we are making a law. Till parliament make a law, we are issuing a guideline or instruction under in exercise of power under Article 142 of the Constitution that these guidelines should be followed. And it is only when the law was made by the parliament in 2012 that you can say that that guidelines ultimately culminated into a law made by the parliament. So the judiciary also makes law while interpreting the law, but it cannot make law, it cannot substitute its judgment or wisdom for the wisdom of the legislature, because the law making is the process available to the parliament. Now, again, I give you very critical and important example. I talked about the law passed by the parliament with regard to appointment of judges. Now, the law has been struck down by the Supreme Court in spite of the fact saying that it violates the basic principle of the basic structure of the Constitution, in spite of the fact that the law was passed unanimously by the parliament, by all, no member of parliament voted against this law. But if the legislature felt that it was not correct, the law was wrongly struck down by the court, it could have come out with a new legislation, removing the deficiencies which were pointed out in the earlier legislation and bringing out a new legislation. But the parliament, in its wisdom, till date has not thought to bring a new legislation dealing with the appointment of judges. And the same process which was laid down in three judgments given by the Supreme Court from 1992 onward, under that law itself and under the procedural procedural order passed by the Supreme Court, approved by the central government, the appointments are being made. Parliament in its wisdom has not decided to make a law, but it could have made a law. So that is a prerogative of the parliament. If it doesn't want to make a law, it can't. But as a matter of policy, if parliament want to make a law, nobody can question it why parliament is making a law on this subject in case the parliament has got competency to make a law on that subject. It is only the competency which is to be seen, but you cannot question the wisdom of the parliament to make a law on a particular subject. That is the prerogative. Whether a law should be made or should not be made is the prerogative of the legislature. But if a law is made, its interpretation so far is concerned, Supreme Court can interpret it. But if that interpretation is not acceptable to the legislature, legislature is free to enact another legislation, removing the deficiencies which have been pointed out by the judiciary. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, sir. So we have the next question by Saurabh Paul. He asks, lately there has been a lot of ambiguity regarding the enforcement of foreign seated emergency awards. Sir, do you think this is because of the language of Section 9 of the Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996?
Well, I think this is a very specific question. Yes, so far as if I have to give a straightforward answer, I'll say yes. But again, as I said, even if there is an ambiguity in the legislation, that doesn't mean that the legislation cannot be implemented. The power given to the judiciary under our constitution is wide enough to take care of that, following the principles of interpretation as has been laid down. And as you know, recently, I think Justice Rohinton has come out with certain judgments, even with regard to the amendments which have been made in the Arbitration and Conciliation Act, either in 2015 or in 2019, in spite of the fact that one of the issue which was not before the Supreme Court commented on that also with regard to the retrospective applicability of certain amendments made in 2015. So because that prerogative is available with the judiciary, in case there is an ambiguity, then the interpretation given by the judiciary, to which we normally call as a judge-made law, will prevail to deal with this kind of situation which you are talking about.
Thank you, sir. So, Saurav Paul's next question is, sir, do you think the plain language drafting movement should be revived in India?
Yes, I personally feel attempt has been made in the past also in this regard. But I tell you, it's very easy to say that the legislation should be drafted in plain language. But when it really comes to drafting, because you have to take care of so many aspects of the society, it becomes very difficult to cover all aspects by using the plain language. When I said that you use plain language, what I mean is that if you want to say a thing, write small sentences instead of lengthy sentences. By putting comma and adding one sentence to another sentence, probably that complicate the thing. I gave you an example of the Income Tax Act Section 80 HHC. My request to all the participants here, the students, is go and see this particular section. I think it runs into almost 2 pages, and one sentence of this section will be running into 8 or 10 printed lines. It is very difficult to comprehend and understand it. When I'm talking of simple language, my simple language is use short sentences, use simple words. Not necessarily that the object should not be achieved, object should be achieved. And then what happens many a time, we want to put everything in the principal legislation. We don't want to leave many things to be decided by the executive by its rule-making power under the act. Generally, Parliament makes a law and give a rule-making power to the executive, the central government or the state government. If we leave many procedural aspects to the state government or the central government to be exercised by rule-making power, without, of course, compromising with the fundamental features of the law, then I think our objective can be served, because many amendments in the law will not be needed. By making the rules, probably the objective can be achieved. So I think instead of making a detailed legislation, make the legislation as small, as cryptic as you can. Make it an enabling legislation instead of putting every detail into the legislation. So I'll take, for example, the Companies Act also. The earlier Act of 1956 was replaced by an Act of 2013. From 2013 till date, it has again been amended, I think, if I correctly remember, almost 5 times. And every amendment contains about 100 amendments, 190, 80 amendments. This kind of amendments can be avoided if we are a little more cautious in properly drafting the legislation. Sometimes, as I said, it is not necessarily that it is the draftsman's responsibility, because policymakers are also equally responsible. The legislature also take care of this aspect, because this goes to the parliamentary committees for scrutiny, and before the parliamentary committees also, the objections and suggestions are invited from the public also. Public also participate in this kind of deliberation. So if proper input is given to the committee, Probably all these things can be taken care of. But as I said in my initial remarks, still you cannot get a perfect legislation. Like Constitution is a living organ. Therefore, every statute, depending on the requirement of the statute, needs amendment from time to time. Therefore, although we are not following this practice, but in certain countries there is a practice which says that in every legislation there should be a sunset clause. What is this sunset clause? Sunset clause says that the validity of this legislation is, say, for a period of 10 years. So automatically after 10 years, the legislation goes unless the parliament reviews it and says that legislation need to be continued for another 5 years or 10 years, or it should be replaced by another legislation. So I think time has come when in our country, if we really want to reduce the number of legislations, because normally it is alleged that India is an over legislated country. We have large number of legislation and they need to be repealed. The government of India has already undertaken this exercise and a large number of legislations have already been repealed. But still there are many which need to be repealed. And if there is a sunset clause in the legislation, probably this kind of situation can be taken care of, because per force the legislation will be required to review those legislation and bring a new legislation, taking into account the later developments which are required to be taken care of.
So we have quite a few more questions, but since we are running out of time, I'll have to skip to the last question. This is on behalf of the Weekend Lecture Series, and it says, Sir, what kinds of internships should we be pursuing to further our interest in legislative drafting? Will it be policy-based think tanks?
I think that's another good question, and they take care of the concern which I have expressed, because most of the universities are not giving due attention to the subject of legislative drafting, and it is a very, very specialized subject. Let me tell you that the Ministry of Law and Justice is or state government or the central government, they are not meant for the students. But yes, after passing your law degree as an intern, you can definitely work with the legislative department or the legal department of the state government or in the Ministry of Law and Justice, because they provide this kind of opportunity. Similarly, there is an institute known as Bureau of Parliamentary Studies in the parliament itself, which carries out this kind of exercise, and probably internship can be done in those departments also. Some of the universities have now come up with a separate dedicated department dealing with the imparting training or giving certificate course for conducting training and certificate course in legislative drafting. Some of the universities where I am associated with, one is of course KIT University in Bhubaneswar, KIIT, School of Law, KIT University, Bhubaneswar. They are conducting some legislative drafting courses, which I know because I am associated with that. One university, Manav Rachana University in Faridabad, has also established a center for legislative drafting and research. And there are some NGOs also, like I think Vidhi is also doing some research work on this. And there are many other institutions which are doing. Probably I think your own university can start this kind of, establish a center for legislative drafting, where experts who are doing this job on desk, maybe in the Ministry of Law or in the state legislature, or for that matter, even the parliamentarian or the state legislature, who can come and interact with the students and can tell them as to what are the pitfalls which need to be taken care of, or what are the areas where legislations are required, or what are the areas where legislations are existing but need to be reviewed. I think all this can be taken care of. And it's not that the opportunities are not there, opportunities are there. But only thing is, there are very limited number of opportunities available, because this is not a compulsory subject to be taught in the law colleges.
So we really wish we could have heard more from you, but since we are running short of time, So that was indeed a wonderful and very informative session. I'm sure each one of us who had the opportunity and the privilege to listen to you today has gained some knowledge. And coming from someone of your repute, it really means a lot to us. We sincerely thank you for taking out your time to address us this afternoon and be a part of this session and discussion. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Kavya, and thanks to all the whole team of weekend lecture series of the National University of Judicial Sciences, West Bengal, Calcutta. And I wish you all the best. And feel free if anytime you feel that any input is needed from my side, I am always available. Thank you very much. Take care. And once again, best wishes for the Constitution Day, which will be tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Stay safe. Have a great day, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.